Hello everyone! We are Marilee
and Irina,
and we're the newly appointed directors of the Neura Club.
We are so excited to share our platform with you, our knowledge, and please stay tuned for our upcoming articles, interviews, especially this one with a PhD student from Cambridge, Emily Tucker.
We hope you enjoy this interview. Let's get on to it.
First of all, let's start with the first question. Can you tell us a bit about your background and what actually inspired you to pursue a PhD in neuroscience or psychology?
Yeah, so I've always kind of been interested in psychology. I took AP psychology in high school, which is kind of it's like a college level psychology class. In the US, you can kind of take a few college level classes when you're in high school. And so that kind of like sparked my interest at the very beginning. Go to university for about 3 years after I finished high school. And when I started, I really had no idea what I wanted to do. So I kind of pivoted to a completely different direction and did communications. I thought maybe I wanted to go into like writing or journalism. And I was also just really daunted by the idea of doing graduate school. And I know that, in psychology, or neuroscience, there are some positions that you can do with just a bachelor's, but you really kind of need to go on to do further study if you want to have a career in many of the fields that are psychology and neuroscience. So I was really daunted by that. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do something different and see how it goes. But this kind of interest kept up throughout my whole undergrad, and I minored in psychology. And by the end, I decided that I did want to go to graduate school. So I actually took another year and a half and did it's called a post-bac program, but it's kind of like a conversion type course. If you did a different undergraduate degree, you basically do all of the same requirements that you need for a psychology degree. So it's almost like doing a kind of like second sort of bachelor's in psychology. And that's where I really got involved in research. And at the time, I thought I wanted to go into like clinical psychology. And I really had no idea what research even was or what it involved. But then I really fell in love with research and decided that actually I was more interested in that than seeing patients and doing therapy. So I decided to focus more on research, and then did a master's in social science with a focus on psychology, looking at adolescent development after early adversity. So children who had been adopted from international orphanages into the US, and then how they were doing later on. So kind of looking at how that early experience of adversity affected their mental health in adolescence. And then from there, kept up with that and wanted to do a PhD in the similar kind of field. So applied to work with Sarah Jane Blakemore at Cambridge, and she is really well known for the field of adolescent neurodevelopment, and was kind of one of the first pioneers looking at brain development during this period and how it continues up to the age of 25. So that's kind of how I got interested in it. I guess also just how I got interested in adolescence specifically was, I think it's such an interesting time because I took, so a lot of the things that we know about adolescence and the behaviors that they do, such as like risk taking and exploration, I feel like those were all the things that kind of led me to the path that I'm on. And that if I hadn't made those decisions when I was an adolescent, I might not have pursued this path. So that was kind of how I got specifically interested in this field.
Yeah, that's really cool. So for your current project that you're working on, your research, I just want to ask, are you doing also any other research projects apart from adolescence, and what are they, and what potential impact can you maybe foresee them having in the field, in the neuroscience field?
It was actually planned before COVID, but became really relevant during the COVID pandemic when all the social distancing and things came in, and how people were reporting really decreases in their mental health. So we wanted to look at kind of like why, what are the underlying mechanisms that might lead to kind of decreased well-being. And so threat learning was something that I'm really interested in. And that's kind of the idea that neutral things can be compared with threatening things and create this kind of threat response. So I always use the example of if you're really afraid of public speaking and you have to give a speech like in this one classroom all the time, sometimes even just after repeated exposure to that, sometimes even just that classroom can give you this kind of panic reaction, right? Because you've learned to associate that room with the thing that you're afraid of, which is like giving public speaking, right? And so we can actually measure this in the lab using a really kind of simple computer task. And we found that after isolation, there was this really increased threat learning response compared to baseline. And we did this in an experimental way, which I think was the cool part of this study. So instead of just looking at asking people how lonely they were and then doing a threat learning task, we actually brought the same people in 3 times. We did a baseline session where they had their normal day, they had social contact, they could do whatever they want. Then we had 2 sessions, one session where they were isolated for 4-ish hours. That was also an added element looking at virtual social interaction, so like social media, and whether that could kind of buffer some of the effects of loneliness, right? Because during the pandemic, especially, people were communicating on Zoom and over social media, and we weren't really sure, we still aren't really sure if that was enough, to combat the loneliness or not. So we did this in an experimental way, and we found that, at least in our study, that both isolation sessions led to increased threat responding compared to baseline. So that is kind of my main PhD project. And then I've been involved in a few other projects, including my very last project, which is going to, it's about to start now. It's going to look a little bit more at social media and how specific kind of feedback on social media might impact emotions. Yeah.
You mentioned about your work related to like computer tasks. How about some of the recent technological advancements? Did they have any influence on your research? And do you anticipate on any other upcoming breakthroughs in your field, particularly, especially with the growing field of artificial intelligence? How do you think it will impact your field?
Yeah, it's really interesting. This is like something we've been thinking a lot about. I'm not really in artificial intelligence field specifically, but in fact, when we were designing this new study looking at social feedback, we were thinking about what if that social feedback comes from an AI instead of a person? How does that differentially impact how you feel? Because there are studies showing that even playing a computer game, there's this task called cyberball, which has been used really extensively in the literature. And it's basically a computer task where these 2 characters are on screen, and then you're the 3rd character, and they're throwing a ball to each other and to you. And then there's 2 conditions. So in one condition, the 2 characters stop throwing the ball to you and are only throwing it to each other. And so that's kind of the feeling of like social exclusion. And then in the other condition, they keep like throwing the ball to you, right? And when they first did this study, they told people that those other 2 characters were other players, so like other participants in the study. And they found that this exclusion really impacted mood and feelings of emotions, negative emotions. But then they did a kind of follow-up studies where even when they told them that it was just a computer program, people still reported these kind of negative feelings after being excluded. So that kind of reminds me a little bit in a way of this question of AI, right? Because people are kind of chatting with these AI bots now, using them as kind of like, some people have used them as like life coaches and sort of therapists in a way, asking advice and things like that. So yeah, it's quite interesting to think about how does that social interaction mimic real life social interaction? Does it? And is it sufficient, or is it completely different? So I think it will be really interesting. I think also just as a tool, artificial intelligence is really cool for the way that we do research. So, for example, coming up with stimuli that we might use in experiments can be really useful using artificial intelligence, right? Like if I'm trying to come up with, social feedback in the form of comments or something, using AI to kind of help generate those based on, real trained data. So it's like real, it's more real, more unbiased, I guess, than like the researchers coming up with it themselves. Also thinking about whether AI can help with qualitative research. So I don't know if you know what qualitative research is, but it's a little bit more looking at things that aren't just numbers. So looking at like interviews, written descriptions, things like that, things that are more qualitative, less quantitative. So you can't create like a score from that, but you can transcribe an interview using AI to kind of do some kind of analyses on that data. So maybe grouping things by the emotions that people are describing or saying, or the sentiment, and where that's really hard to do in a large scale with people, right? Because you have to read through the whole thing and you have to code everything, and it's really arduous. And so a lot of qualitative studies have been quite small relatively compared to quantitative studies, which can have, tens of thousands of people. And artificial intelligence might help us kind of like scale up that qualitative research in a way that might help with kind of generalizability and, again, reducing bias in the coding of the data itself. So, two ways that it might help research in general.
Also, how do you find a balance between just theoretical exploration of your research and then actually, conducting an experiment to validate it? And, well, yeah, especially in the field of psychology and neuroscience, because a lot of things can just be theoretical and hard to prove.
Definitely, yeah. I think, interestingly, psychology in a way has historically not been that grounded in theory, which I think is something that we really try to do these days. So thinking about, in the past, you might have heard of kind of the replication crisis that happened started about 10 years ago, maybe a little more, 15 years ago. People started realizing that a lot of these kind of experiments in psychology weren't replicating. So that means that people running the same experiment again couldn't find the same results that the previous paper found, which is a big problem, right? Because you want your results to be robust and you want to be able to say that this is a phenomena that happens consistently, right? Not just in one experiment that might have been kind of an accident, right? This kind of became a problem, I think, a little bit because people were doing a lot of experiments without considering the theory. So considering why might this lead to this, for example. So they were kind of collecting a lot of data, having a lot of different variables. And then once they knew the result, they were kind of coming up with a story as to why that was the case. So that's kind of the wrong way, if you see what I mean. So I think there's a move today to really think first about the theory and think about why might this lead to this. So for example, with the isolation, there's this idea of like the evolutionary theory of loneliness. So if you are alone, you might need to be more vigilant to threats because if you're alone, you are the only person watching out for dangers, right? So like, say you're living in, millions of years ago, whatever, when you're living in the plains and there's a dangerous animal, you need to be the one saying, I see this animal far away and I'm going to escape from it, right? I'm going to run away. Whereas if you're in a big group, other people could be watching. There's kind of like a buffer, right? There's protection in numbers. So there's this kind of theory that maybe this feeling of loneliness leads to this hypervigilance for threat as like a safety kind of mechanism, right? So that was kind of the theory that led to us testing the idea that isolation might lead to enhanced threat learning. So whereas instead of just saying, oh, this might be interesting to look at, let's look at something random after isolation and then come up with an idea. So I think that, grounding things in theory first is quite important just to the scientific process in general, because it's so easy to come up with ideas after the fact that fit the data basically instead of the other way around. And I think though it is also sort of related to, how can we apply this to the real world? And I think that's always a really big question and quite a hard question, especially for research scientists, because we're so involved in the experiments and the mechanisms that we don't often communicate with, policymakers and educators and things, although our lab really does try to outreach with schools and things like we did in giving the talks to your school and with policy. But, having the things that, say, governments and teachers do actually informed by the science is quite hard because it is also just a totally different context, right? Like the classroom is a totally different context than the lab. And so I think it's really valuable as well in future for, policymakers, scientists, educators to work, parents, caregivers to work together to do research in like a more collaborative way so that we can see, does what we're finding in the lab replicate in the classroom, and can that actually be implemented in a way that works, right? Because there's also like logistical things that need to happen in order to run schools and governments and things like that. Hopefully that answers that question.
Most of our viewers would be up and coming future researchers in the science field. We know your background in terms of education. You've been studying in UCLA and Columbia University. We want you to share on your whole process of applying to the PhD program in Cambridge. What key components actually drew you into the Cambridge University PhD program, and how did you actually apply in the process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that the supervisor is the most important part of a postgraduate program. So not as much in undergrad, but in a master's or in a postgrad. I know that's kind of far away for your students. But actually, that's a good point. So for undergrad, I would focus kind of on the program, on the school, on what's available there, making sure that there's, the course offerings and the research labs and things that are of interest to you, but in a more broad. Also, my headphones might die, so if you can't hear me all of a sudden, let me know. So making sure that there's, the areas that you're interested in. So if you're really interested in like behavioral neuroscience, making sure that you don't go to an undergrad that really only does social psychology or something. So making sure that it really encompasses the areas that you think you might be interested in so that you can kind of explore, because I think that's also what the undergraduate experience is really about, exploring what you might be interested in. Like when I first switched and did my post-bac at Columbia, I at first was in a really kind of cognitive focused lab, doing research really on learning and memory and things like that, which are really interesting. But it was when I took my first developmental psychology course at Columbia that I became just really fascinated in development and how things like early adversity might impact later life outcomes. So I changed direction a little bit. So I think that's really the time to explore and kind of see what you're interested in and not be afraid to like, change and do different things. Then I think for the postgraduate, it's the supervisor is really, really key. So, you might say, oh, I really, really want to go to Cambridge, right? But if there's not a supervisor at Cambridge studying what you're really interested in, then it's probably not going to be a good fit, because it's just super important that their interests really align with your interests. So you apply more to the supervisor, at least in psychology. That's not true for every single field, because sometimes some other STEM fields do rotations and lab rotations and things like that, and you don't get an assigned supervisor until later on. But in psychology and neuroscience, typically you really apply to the supervisor. So making sure that their research fits with yours interests is really important. And also just making sure that their lab is a place that you really want to spend 4, 5, 6 years even, I think is really crucial. My supervisor is an incredible scientist, but also just the most amazing person, and really cares about us as people and our well-being, in addition to, our work. And so I think that is really, really critical, because research can be really hard and long, and the stipends are low, and it's can be quite isolating. Sometimes you move far away from your family. My family's all back in the US. So I think finding a balance between that well-being aspect as well as research is really, really important for success, because if you're not happy, you're really not going to produce kind of the best work that you can do.
Could you just expand on that? Because, I mean, as you said, research is long and it's very hard work. How do you find a balance, like, a work-life balance? Do you have any advice that you could share with us?
Yeah, I think Cambridge is a really great environment for that because of the college system that we have here. So I think you guys have a sort of similar thing where you have your houses or something, or group. Yeah, so we have that here. I always say it's like Harry Potter, it's like Hogwarts houses, But the college system here, you're put into a college, and that really is your home. So you live in college, you eat in college, like you have all these kind of clubs and activities and things. And it's really quite separate from your academic work. And I think that's actually really, really helpful, because you have this kind of built-in social support network and activities and things that you can do that are kind of totally separate from your academic department. So I think that's really nice. I think also just taking up those activities is important. I think, thinking about like health and fitness as well. So doing a sport or doing some kind of, outdoor activity where you're getting outside and getting out of the lab, out from in front of your computer is really important. And again, this also just comes a lot down to the lab environment and the supervisor that you had being really supportive of your well-being. So asking questions from prior students or current students. Does the supervisor, does the lab encourage you to take time off? Does it encourage you to, not work on weekends, not work late nights? Obviously, occasionally, when you have a deadline or something, you have to work late nights and weekends. But what is the kind of general environment like with regard to taking care of yourself? And I think that also the UK and Europe is quite good with regard to the work-life balance compared to the US. We're a bit less good at that. But that's probably quite individual as well.
You talked about the Cambridge environment, right? There are loads of different types of people. So in terms of psychology, how do cultural differences and perspectives of different topics actually influence the way we approach and interpret certain topics in neuroscience and psychology? And do you see a need for more cultural diversification in this field?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think that there's kind of these little groups within a field that you'll find once you get kind of more into it. So, for example, in our field of adolescent brain development, there's actually not that many people in it. There's probably, I don't actually know a number, but maybe 20, 30 lab groups around the world that study this. And so we all kind of are aware of each other. We see each other at conferences because the conferences will be very specific to a specific kind of topic or field. And So we kind of all have a very similar language and way of communicating on our specific topic, which I think is helpful because that means that we can work cross collaboratively with people in different countries, different institutions, things like that. But where I do think there is a serious need is expanding beyond just these kind of Western industrialized countries. So there's a lot of people in the UK, there's a lot of people in the US, there's a lot of people in, Norway and Europe and things like that, much fewer outside of that. And I think that is a huge gap in all research fields, but especially psychology, when we're actually studying humans and culture and social things that are really affected by culture. And so I think there has been a move in recent years to really to acknowledge the fact that this research is really going on in a very small number of countries that are all of a kind of a similar cultural background. And I think this is even more important, the more social psychology that you are studying. So maybe it's not as important, although that's debatable, when you're studying cells in the brain, right? Because that should be similar across one species across the world. But then as you're studying these like more social processes, those obviously have hugely different effects. So I think that's still a big gap in the whole field of psychology that is really needs to be thought about more and funded more as well.
Yeah. Well, so this is unrelated, but as someone in your field, can you read people? Like, if you just look at them, can you tell, what maybe if they're nervous or if they're, I don't know, scared or something?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. No, I would say definitely not. And I think especially, well, firstly, I'm not really a clinical psychologist as well. So that would probably, as a clinical psychologist, you receive that kind of training in really how to diagnose people, right? But even clinical psychologists, I think they would say that they're not doing that like on the day to day, right? Like they're not doing that like with their friends and family and other people and stuff. They're really, it's kind of like, would you want to do work when you're not working? Like probably not, right? But I would say that I think you do, as someone who's studied like psychology and neuroscience, you do have a slightly better idea of why things might be the way they are, or why a person might be feeling the way they are. So, for example, if a friend is really struggling and you notice that they're really focusing and ruminating on these negative thoughts, that might be something that you notice more than if you hadn't studied that, right? Like, okay, I think that if they get out of this kind of negative thought pattern, that could be helpful. I try to apply that to my life and to my social interactions, but again, yeah, I'm not clinically trained, so I wouldn't feel super comfortable doing that. Yeah.
With you explaining how you can explain why the way people behave, are there actually any aspects of the brain or the human behavior which you can't actually understand or have the current capacity to explain of what actually happens, and how do you approach this in your research?
Yeah, totally. And that's true for more things than not. I think we understand fewer things than the things we understand, which is exciting for a researcher, but also challenging, right? Because that's another thing I was going to say. There's so many individual differences, which means that just different people respond in different ways to the same situations or even the same diagnosis. So if two people have anxiety, that might manifest in completely different ways in both of those people, but it could still be the same, underlying diagnosis that person has anxiety or something. And that's something that really people have only just started to kind of do more research on now. It used to be really about trying to make these really broad categorizations of symptoms and things like that. So these symptoms are this is this. And nowadays we're thinking more about how actually people might respond in different ways, and how might we be able to kind of like pick that apart a bit more and classify people into more groups than just like yes or no, has this diagnosis or not. Like what underlying features of anxiety might be particularly amenable to a certain type of treatment versus a different type of treatment, so that we can be more like personalized. So the brain, I think, is one we just really don't know much about it at all, right? Like, we've only really been able to even look inside like the living human brain for the last 20 years or so, right? Since we've had the ability to use these like fMRI machines in research. And then thinking again about what that actually tells us, that really just tells us that this area of the brain is more active than another area, right? So what does that actually mean is a bit complicated. So I think, there are so many things that we don't understand. And I think when you get into research, you kind of go smaller and smaller with your questions. It's like in undergrad, you're studying all of these things. You have like this really broad, shallow knowledge. And then as you go up into like PhD and higher, you get a really deep, really small knowledge. So you know a ton about this like very tiny thing. And I think that speaks to kind of your question about, we don't understand this thing. So we want to break it into like these really tiny, tiny questions and try to answer pieces of that in order to try to make sense of something that we don't understand.
Yeah. When you do your research and you, how do you find people? If you're testing it on people, where do you find the people? Are there also students on your campus, or is it just absolutely random people?
We recruit a lot from schools. So that's just the nature of our kind of age demographic, being adolescents. We recruit from a lot of schools in the kind of Cambridge and London area. So we'll often like go in to do like a talk or something like we've done for your school. And then they'll, if people are interested in participating in our studies, they can kind of find us that way. For research in adults, so 18 and over, they do use students a lot. Yeah, so they'll recruit university students on your campus. That's actually a huge portion of research participants in all fields of psychology are undergraduate students. So that's another kind of interesting question of, does that sample really generalize to the whole world if we're only studying 18 to 22-year-old college students, mostly in the US. So that's kind of interesting. And then, we recruit, we also kind of recruit through social media, through online advertisements, people that do younger ages or clinical samples will recruit through like hospitals, for example. Sometimes like if they're doing studies on newborns, they'll recruit at clinics that see pregnant people, and they'll give them information about upcoming studies for when their child is born. There's kind of, you can recruit people online as well nowadays. If you have a study that can be completed online, like a survey or something like that, there's services that will recruit people online. So there's quite a bunch of different ways. It is quite complicated though, especially if you're recruiting hard to reach samples. So when I was at UCLA, we did a lot of work with people who had experienced early adversity in the form of being in institutional care or being adopted at a young age. And so that was a particularly kind of hard to find sample. So we would go to different kind of events. Like there were some conferences for like adoptive parents and things like that. So we'd have a booth there and we'd talk to parents and see if people were interested. So you kind of have to get creative in recruiting because it can be quite difficult.
Yeah.
I've been meaning to ask this question since a long time ago from someone of your field. So there has been a flux of people more interested in MBTI types or Enneagram types, trying to put a label on themselves and the type of person they are. Why do you think that happens, and why do you think people strive to put a certain label to their personality and who they are?
Yeah, it's a good question. Firstly, I would say that as far as like those two types, I don't think that there's too much scientific evidence for those specific things, but there are some other types of personality. It's generally called personality psychology research that are a little bit more kind of evidence-based. So for example, there's like the Big Five, I think it's called, where there's like 5 different traits and there's this really long questionnaire and you get a score on each trait. There's like extroversion, openness,
neuroticism, some other things I can't quite remember. So just I would say, just be aware that some are more evidence-based than others. Even though the ones that aren't are quite fun. Like I still enjoy, I enjoy doing that kind of stuff. I enjoy like horoscopes. I know that's bad coming from a scientist, but I think they're kind of fun, even though I know that they're completely, not evidence-based. But as far as to why people enjoy doing that, I think it's again kind of trying to understand yourself and others. And sometimes that can be easier when you have like a box kind of that you might fit into. So I think it's a little bit the same with kind of diagnoses of mental health disorders, right? Like sometimes people get a lot of relief when they're diagnosed with something like ADHD or autism, because they say, oh, this finally kind of explains why I feel this way, why I behave this way. It also kind of creates a community. So if you know that there are other people out there that have this specific personality type or this specific diagnosis, you can kind of learn from them and see how they've dealt with things and coped with things in a way that I think can be really helpful. So I think it's a bit about the community, understanding oneself. I think it's just important to be aware too that, again, to the individual differences thing, not everyone who has autism or ADHD is going to react and behave in exactly the same way. So knowing that there can be variation even within a category, is important to know.
And in your research, do you ever have any just ethical reasons as to why you can't conduct it, and how do you, I guess, deal with it? Or has there ever been a time where you wanted to conduct a research and there were just some ethical concerns with it?
Yeah, so that's a big part of the research process is thinking about the ethical implications. And we actually have to submit a huge kind of ethics application before we even start the study for every study that we do. And that's true in most places, I believe. In the US, it's called like institutional review. Here it's called ethics approval. And that really makes you kind of go through each point of your study and thinking about the ethical implications and also what you've done to kind of minimize or reduce the risk for those things. And then a whole committee basically reviews your application, provides comments, might provide things that you need to change before you can get their kind of stamp of approval on your study. And it's peer reviewed, so by people in your field, in your institution. And so it's a pretty rigorous process to do that for good reason. You'll probably learn in your psychology courses that, back in the day, there was not really ethical approval for studies. And some of the studies ended up being quite psychologically harmful to people, even if they weren't physically harmful. So the study where, I don't know if you know of the study, where the Milgram experiments, where they had to do the electric shocks, but they were fake to a participant, and the person told them to continue until it was so bad that like the person had a heart attack or something, ostensibly, even though they were fine. And that really kind of had a serious effect on the people who delivered those shocks, even though they were fake, right? So I think thinking about the fact that the experience for the participant is different than just the researcher. And even though the question might be worthwhile, thinking really about, can we do this ethically, especially when you're working with people who are under 18, so children and teenagers. There are even, much stricter ethical protocols. And then we also just kind of try to really address those. So we will do things like we always keep data really stored securely and privately and separate from any kind of identifying information, so that research data could never be linked to that person. Then we destroy the codes that connect those two things after the research is completed, things like that. Also thinking about kind of support that we can provide to participants in case they become uncomfortable during the experiment. So for example, in the isolation study, we had a clinical psychologist on call in case somebody felt really distressed by the isolation period. And we had protocols for, they could end it at any time if they really became distressed. And we provided mental health resources and things like that. So I think it's just about thinking through the protocols. And there's obviously some things that you just will never be able to do ethically. And that might necessitate a slightly different research design. So for example, the early adversity work, where we're interested in how does early adversity affect later life, we obviously cannot subject people to adversity, right? Like we can't say, we're going to assign these children to an adverse experience for the first 2 years of their life, right? Like that is completely unethical. So we have to use these different designs where we find kind of natural experiments. So we recruit participants who by chance had experienced those experiences early in life and then study them later in life. So yeah, just thinking about kind of what your question necessitates and whether you can do that in a way that is the least harmful as possible.
Adding on to finding people specifically with the experience they have had for your research, we did a podcast about different attachment styles, and we discussed about how actually child traumas can affect the way you grow and become. So in your research topic about adolescence, could you perhaps explain how these child traumas can lead on to your adolescent life?
Yeah, so they can lead to a bunch of different kind of outcomes, but mostly, reduced well-being, increased anxiety, sometimes some kind of accelerated development. So that's kind of an interesting theoretical reason for why we might see some of these changes. So that is the idea that that humans develop really slowly over a really long period of time for an adaptive kind of reason. So the longer you have to, the longer like the plasticity in your brain, the longer you have to learn and grow and change and kind of adapt to all of these really complicated situations that we experience. But somebody who experiences like a really harsh early life, it might actually be beneficial for their brain to kind of mature quicker. So to get to an adult-like state faster. But we find that when that happens, you're kind of sacrificing a little bit of the like structural integrity and the flexibility that you would get if that took like a really long time. I'm trying to think of a metaphor, but maybe like if you're baking something and it requires like an hour to bake, right? And like you could turn up the heat and bake it for 10 minutes, but like it's probably going to be a little bit strange, right? Like it might be really crispy on the outside, but kind of doughy on the inside, and it's like not quite, but it like got there to the point because you turned the heat up really fast, right? Whereas like if it had been a slow, long, lower temperature kind of process, it would have been like really perfect by the end, right? For the environment. So it's kind of like, that's probably a bad metaphor, but it's kind of like a similar process with the brain. And so this adult-like state might be kind of helpful if you're experiencing adversity, because you need to be as capable as possible of fending for yourself at a younger age, but you might not be as able then to do things adaptively later in life as well. So for example, emotionally, so you might develop some kind of really strong emotional response to negative things, because maybe when you're a child, that alerts people around you that you have a need that needs to be met, right? But having a really strong emotional response later in life might not be as adaptive, right? You might want to be able to calm yourself kind of down and have a more kind of calm reaction. So that's just one example of how early adversity can affect later life. And there's also now the thought that different types of adversity might affect later outcomes in different ways. So for example, there's a really big difference between like abuse and neglect early in life. So one, abuse is more, might lead to more kind of like vigilance, right, towards threats, things like that. Whereas neglect is a little bit different. And so that might lead to kind of a reduced reward seeking or something like that. Those are just, I'm just kind of making those examples up. But so also thinking about the dimensions of adversity and how it's not all the same. It's not as if you just kind of, all adversity leads to the same outcomes. Also, the timing is quite important too. So we know that different functions are maturing at different times. And so when that adversity occurs in development could affect specific systems given when it occurred. So I think the best example of this is like if you are put in a dark room from birth and you can't see anything, your eyes will never properly develop. The brain, not your eyes, but actually the part of the brain, the occipital part of the brain that controls your vision will never develop properly because it didn't have that input to your eyes, to your brain, because it was dark. So you will never, like you might never be able to see properly your whole life. Whereas if you put a 5-year-old in a dark room for the same amount of time, a year or something, it's already developed. So it probably won't have the same impact on their visual system as if it was when they were younger. But when you're 5, different things are developing, right? So it might have a much more profound impact on something that's developing at that time. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I think we'll end on our last question. What are some thoughts you have on the future of the neuroscience and psychology field? Like, is there anything that we should be aware about in the future? And is there something that will actually change the whole of the field?
It's a good question.
Like any trends that might appear in in the neuroscience field.
I think going back to AI, it's probably things like AI and machine learning. So for example, we already see some research looking at, because we really have the computing power to do this now, whereas we didn't. So if you think about the brain, when you take a brain scan, there's hundreds of individual slices of images. Basically, you take an image here and then here and then here and then, across and all the way back. So there's a ton of images, and each of those images is broken up into tiny little voxels, right? So a voxel is like a 3D pixel. So in a photo, it's a pixel, but you can think of voxel as a 3D pixel in your brain, right? So there's like hundreds of thousands of those in your brain. And so that's a lot of data. That's like a ton of data points. And so one thing that's become more popular is using these kind of machine learning approaches to classify patterns in this data instead of just looking at activity in one region specifically, because that's kind of what people have done in the past. They've had a region of interest, looked at the activity in all the voxels in that region and compared that, say, during one task to another task condition. But now people are kind of utilizing the kind of high definition nature of this data to use machine learning to say what kind of patterns in individual voxels might predict different conditions or different states of emotion or mood, things like that, or even what people are seeing. So can we predict what image people are seeing based on the different patterns of voxel activity in their occipital lobe, where we know that the visual system is processing information. So I think, continuing to use those kinds of approaches as opposed to these very univariate, large region approaches might be interesting, because we know the brain is a huge network. And so actually looking at patterns of activation in small regions that you might not be able to really delineate with traditional statistical methods, machine learning can kind of parse those a little bit and tell us a little bit more about specific states. So I think that's probably a pattern that's going to continue and hopefully become even more advanced in the next years.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to answer our questions. It was really cool for us to receive all this knowledge, and we really enjoyed it, and we hope you did as well.
We are very
Yeah.
confident that the people watching this interview will be overflooded with like all of the information you've given us and shared with us. So thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. No, it was great. Great questions. And yeah, looking forward to hearing what people think about it.
I hope
Okay.
you enjoyed it as well.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See
Bye.
you.